Before we jump into today's episode, I just wanted to make a note that this was recorded using mobile devices. We really wanted to bring you an episode this week, but Greg was traveling, so we decided to record a phone conversation between us. As a result, the audio quality isn't quite as high as previous episodes, but rest assured next week we will be back with our standard recording setup, and we will be back to our regularly scheduled programming. And as always, thanks for listening. Hello everyone, and welcome to Gaming Mechanics, a podcast seeking to explore the unexplored topics of games, how they work, and why we love them. I'm your host Mark, and with me is Greg.
What's up?
And this episode is brought to you as Gaming Mechanics Mobile. Where's Bane when you need him?
Oh, yes.
Time to go mobile.
Yeah, exactly.
But, yes, Greg is traveling.
17 minutes. Time to go mobile. Yep, I'm out. I'm in the beautiful. Well, actually, I'm still in Jersey. I was out visiting my brother in New York City. It's not what you think of when you think of Jersey. It's going back towards. I'm going back towards the Midwest. So going back west, and I'm going towards Pennsylvania. So rural Pennsylvania is gorgeous, man. I've never been out there. It's also friggin' gigantic.
Yeah, I believe it.
I've never been out. I've never driven this way. So it was magnificent.
Yeah, I can't say I've ever been to that part of the
country. If you're out in rural Pennsylvania, and any of our listeners are out there, then you got a nice area here. Also, if you hear a sudden, crash and scream, then just keep going. I'll get back to you later.
Yeah. This has been your final minutes immortalized, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Wow, that's really dark. Anyway, so today we are going to talk a little bit about the phenomenon of beginner's luck and just the way that game strategies evolve within a community and how the community itself can start to lose track of why it does what it does.
Yeah.
Launching into that topic, I guess an obvious example that comes to mind for me is like in chess. I know we talk about chess a lot. Actually, neither me or Greg are very proficient at chess, but it's a very common game. It's classic. And most people probably know what beginner's checkmate is or fool's mate. If you push a certain pawn, you could potentially end up in checkmate in about 5 moves.
Right.
An early chess player might be told just to not use that opening. They might have the painful experience of actually having gotten into beginner's checkmate, which is a little embarrassing.
Right.
But they might just be told, this is how you open, right? E4.
Yeah, they're taught a really basic standard opening.
So they just don't deviate from that. That's the good opening. That's what they decide to do. For the first year or two of them playing chess, they just kind of instinctively do that. They don't experiment a lot without realizing that the reasons behind why that's an opening that you do. That happens on a much more complicated scale with gaming communities and competitive gaming. MOBAs, I think, are a great example of this, where the play style is very well defined, not by any programming, but actually just by the assumptions and decisions that the players have decided are optimal. So talking about like lane distribution in League, it's very, very fixed. HOTS is a bit more distributed depending on the map and the objectives and what heroes you have.
Mm-hmm.
You have any more thoughts along those lines, Greg?
The interesting thing about like those standard openings, standard builds, is that basically at the end of the day, even if they did experiment, that's what they would come back to anyway. Like that's the point, is that you just, with a game that's well established like chess, you have basically all the legwork, all the grunt work has been done.
Right. There's so many people who've played the game and decided that this is a good or reasonable opening, and this is a bad opening. I mean, there's literally a Wikipedia page of the list of like the worst chess openings.
So anyway, in that regard, the closest thing I can think of, at least personally, of experience is to come back to Overwatch. That's one of the very few games I kind of kept track of since its inception, and even before its release with some beta stuff. And some of the like early beta tournaments that were played, and then all the way through its current form, to see exactly that process happen has been really, really cool. I didn't have too much part in it because I'm just a gold level scrub. But and the other differentiation I wanted to make was the difference between like the pro scene and the casual scene, right? Because if you talk about like MOBAs, of course you have certain things that be like standard, really important standard builds. In a MOBA, like you said, like lane composition, right? No matter what level of play, that's a thing that you have to do correctly. But like in a game like Overwatch, if you think about like even just like how to play the first the first point on King's Row or something, how to attack that. In competitive, there's a way to do that. There's a correct way to break through that little choke point and make it into the courtyard and survive and take the point. In a casual game, obviously that way, that professional way would work well if pulled off correctly. But there's also, it matters who you're playing against, right? Like if two people are playing chess who don't know chess at all, then a standard opening might not even work too well.
Yeah, it almost doesn't. It doesn't really matter.
So similarly, if you're playing them against really casual people in Overwatch, then yeah, maybe you use a horrible team comp and a stupid strategy, and it works because the other team's stupid too. MOBAs are that's an interesting exception, right? So like no matter what level of play in MOBAs, you still that's not even entirely true. Like in Dota 2, right? Like having like dual lane offlane or like dual offlane is something that happens pretty commonly in low levels of play, and that like lane composition basically is something that isn't completely uniform, even in low levels of play.
Right.
You'll have people that will not kind of play the correct distribution of lanes. So saying that it does matter as well the level of play and who you're playing with.
Your mentioning of Overwatch reminded me of something about the play system, and I recently have started playing Overwatch, and I love it, and I could rant about the game design and a few of the specific characters that I really like, but yeah, I think we'll either save. You might get a teaser at the end of this episode, but that'll mostly be next week.
Right.
But one of the things in Overwatch that I think might create ignorance about why you don't do this is when you have the little tips on the side selecting characters saying, too many defensive characters, too many snipers.
Oh yeah.
I have no idea why it's bad to have too many snipers. Like I don't know, and I've never played a game where we had too many snipers because of that little tooltip. Now, I trust the game designers, and there's a reason why they put that stuff in there. But I think that happens on an informal level in a lot of gaming communities where they'll say like, "Oh, you can't have four assassin characters in a MOBA on one team." And I would think, well, why not? Like, what's going to happen? Um, and a lot of times you actually it's not clear even to the experienced players what would happen because nobody does that because that's not the way that you play the game.
Right, exactly. So that's an interesting thing. Like we talked about, kind of a stable meta that comes out, in terms of, you said, kind of quote unquote solving the game, right? Tons of people playing it for hundreds of hours, and professionals really good. Mechanics aren't the problem, and finding the best combinations of the way to play the game. But, and I'd say that probably happens like 90% of the time where people are right. But then there's like stuff, obviously, like we talked about with Smash or other games where people discover something new, right? And it turns out that this preconceived notion of like, hey, this is the way to play the game, doesn't work. It actually happened. I was watching.
Yeah, it gets overturned.
Exactly, which is awesome. I think that's just such a cool thing. Like, but this actually happened in the Heroes of the Storm mid-season brawl, which is part of the Heroes Global League, HGC, which is kind of the big professional, global standardized league for Heroes of the Storm. And I was watching that, and the mid-season brawl is the big mid-season tournament that has, it basically is it's as huge as, it's I think 32 teams. No, it was like 12 or 14. Anyway, it was a big tournament and one of the two biggest Heroes tournaments on the scene. And the point was that basically there was there's a it was actually really cool to see across regions how the different metas played against each other. So it was, North America, Korea, China, EU, and then some Pacific regions in Australia. But anyway, the point is that there was a pretty standard meta, at least across. Again, just in general, there's some difference in terms of team composition and stuff, but except for there was one style of play from a Chinese team that was absolutely super aggressive. It took a lot of things for granted, like one of the rules in Here's the Storm is to not team fights when you're down a man. I think in MOBAs, right? If it's a 4v5, you're probably just going to lose no matter what. These guys, can't remember the freaking name. I don't want to say Temple Storm, but that's an NA team. Anyway, it was a really successful Chinese team that would begin taking these really aggressive team fights, actually, and sticking around. Even if they got a man picked, they'd stick around after, when they were down a man. Usually you try to disengage or retreat as best you can. And they would actually stick around, and they would swing these team fights and win like a 3v5. It was insane. going
Interesting.
forward. And because players, other these top Korean teams and top EU teams got massacred by them because they had no. Because what happens when you lose a man is the other team disengages, trace, and they take
Right, it's
match,
classically
and
be
they
called a rout.
exactly, and they leaned into these fights and then would wipe the other team. And for a lot of the tournament, people didn't know what to do, and they had huge success. They ended up petering out in after the group stages and didn't find too much success. But it was really cool to watch. Basically,
Yeah.
it was the style that no one had seen, and by any other, and they draft hero compositions to really complement this. And initially, even the analysts were like, "This is going to get murdered. Like this is so far outside of meta. This isn't going to work."
Mm-hmm.
And they absolutely murdered some top Korean and EU teams. It was really fun to watch. So it's like stuff like that is interesting to me. That's like, of course, as we're talking, like, yeah, there are these like kind of quote unquote stalled versions of the game.
Mm-hmm.
But then every once in a while, you have this thing that looks just completely stupid, and everyone's like, ah, no, that's not going to work, and then it absolutely upturns what is currently there. That's a fascinating thing to think about and find.
Yeah,
Really some
that's a
overlap.
very interesting case study. I would love to look further into that and understand kind of what that team had
Yeah.
done. Um, but I think that's a fantastic example of what we're talking about,
Yeah.
where people experiment with the meta. A lot of times it's not clear how to counter it because sometimes players don't know
Exactly.
why they're playing the way that they're playing and why that is the optimal. And it might turn out that they're wrong, that it's not, well, the way they're playing isn't optimal, and actually there was just something they hadn't thought of. But I think it also
Right.
can happen where it actually is suboptimal, but the players that they're playing against, they've just forgotten how to counter it because it's so uncommon.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because there's so much
Yeah. I was about to say
uniformity
that.
in the existing teams. And I think that's where you get into beginner's luck territory, where
Yeah. Yeah.
a
Yeah. No,
beginner
that's a great.
doesn't have it doesn't have an established way to play the game. They're going to try oddball stuff. They're going to try stuff that they're going to do things that you might consider cheese, or you might consider broken, or you might just consider like dumb, and it might actually do well because players aren't ready to respond to that, even like
Yeah.
cognitively. Like they
Totally.
your mind isn't ready to counter that random character who just like went and sat on your nexus like when there was a team fight happening,
Precisely.
and you're like, wait, why wasn't that
And that.
character in the team fight? And you're like, well, they were beginner, they don't know any better.
Yeah. Yeah. And it actually worked out. And of course, that's a mass minority of those things happening. But that does happen. And I think it's cool to think about, like, even in a professional level, those guys, they really get up, eat, and play the game, and like that's it. And they practice with other professionals, right?
Right.
And even in team houses, right? Sometimes with those that happens. So all they do is continually reinforce. I mean, obviously there's got to be some level of attempting to innovate and bring out some new stuff, but it's always within that tiny kind of community
Right.
of people they're practicing with, and I think that really actually depresses or reduces the amount of creativity or ability to think outside their already kind of preconceived constructions of the game on how to do things, as opposed to, like, and I think that's why this Chinese team was so successful, is that they didn't play many Western teams, or even the Korean teams too much. They're very consistent within China, and that's such a different kind of breeding ground for those ideas. So I think it's really cool that, like, yeah, even cognitive, like you were talking about, like there's no schema for how to react to some of these things. And so when a beginner comes in and stumbles on something that is quote unquote like wrong or inappropriate gameplay, it's very possible that they're still playing suboptimally. Like that's not going to become the new norm. It was just new, right? And no one had seen it, and they hadn't learned how to react to it yet. And then they'll learn how to react to it, and then that strategy, that hyper aggressive style, isn't going to work anymore. But for that tournament, at least, they didn't have the time to learn how to react.
Right.
And regardless if it was optimal or suboptimal, that's very dominating.
Right. It became good because it was just different. Even if,
Exactly.
existing strategies do exist to counter it, the fact that those strategies aren't readily available makes that
Yeah.
way of playing good for like a moment in time.
Yeah. Exactly. And that's a big thing just with tournaments in general. Competitive scene of tournaments is just the ability to be able to react in real time in a multi-day or week tournament to new strategies. That's definitely part of the skill there.
Right. And we see that with like Hearthstone tournaments. People talk about teching in certain cards in order to deal with existing,
Yeah.
strategies that are doing well in the
That are
tournament.
beginning.
Yeah, decks that are rising to the top of the ladder. And so people will tech in
Yep.
certain cards specifically to counter that. But
Yep.
I'm reminded of a recent Hearthstone tournament where a lot of the top decks were similar. They differed by very few
Yep.
cards. And I think a
Yep.
game like Hearthstone does lend itself to very fast developing and then very rigid after they're set metas, where like
Yep.
these are the
Very much
cards
so.
that you play. There's a room for, if you don't like this card so much, you can put in like one other card, and that's kind of as much
Yep.
flexibility as there is.
Yep. So, did we talk? I forget if we talked about this on on the show or offline, but yeah, specifically Hearthstone's really been going the route of designing decks far more than cards, where they build and they release a new expansion. They release the set of cards very specifically to work together in kind of like one or two ways, and all these cards play off each other. It's very clear what kind of decks they want you to be building and using, which is cool in that from a design standpoint, they get to be really specific and design these really cool interactions. But that will wear off after like a few weeks because there's only like two or three archetypes for each class, if that. Almost only one kind of viable one, and a lot less kind of lateral space for players to be able to figure out new ways to make cards work together. Which I think is such a cool thing about card games in general is that half of it, if not more, is the deck building, is getting to see all these cool interactions, trying to figure out new ways to make things work. And
Hmm.
when it's designed from a standpoint to only work in one way together, it'll work really great. And because it's designed that way, but it's really hard for players to actually. I think that's something Magic does pretty darn well. You can probably speak more into that. Is that there's a lot fewer archetypes and a lot more kind of ability for people to build things that are cool and unique.
Well, some of that in Magic just comes from the very, very large card base. If you're just playing something like, Legacy, where you can literally use any card that's ever been printed, and
Yeah.
two friends
Right.
hanging out, that might be what they play. Because, oh, you were into Magic in 2009, and I was into Magic in 2005, and we don't have cards that are standard or even extended, but we're just gonna play
Right.
together and see what happens. And you can get
Yeah.
some really interesting combos because although some Magic card design does follow those principles of, I've heard people who develop Magic cards talk about, we want cards that are rare to be cards that you could build a deck around, and where there's a mechanic where that this is it's a deep enough and powerful enough mechanic that if you support this card well, you'll have a good deck, and that's what they want a rare card
Right.
to be. Um, but I do think they've got a little bit more balance in terms of this is exactly how you support the card, versus you find a way to
Yeah.
support the card, or like there are a few different ways you could support the card in different contexts. And I think again,
Sure.
some
Sure. Sure.
some of that probably has to do with just Magic being a little bit more fluid than Hearthstone in general, where it
Mm.
doesn't lock you into a specific class and things like that.
Right.
It can be hard to show up and know how these cards go together. If there is a
Mm.
very specific way, the solution space, or I guess the combination space, the way to effectively put
Right.
cards together is relatively sparse. And so if you just kind of jump
Yep.
in and you're like, this card seems cool and this card seems cool, let's see if they can work together. I think the answer is usually no. Uh, and that
Right.
can be tough. It actually leads to a dearth of sort of this beginner's luck, or it's not very beginner friendly, because if
Yep.
you just have an idea real quick off the top of your head that these cards might go together, it
Right.
probably won't work out. And I've experienced that a lot with Magic. I've played a little bit of Hearthstone, but where I thought that card
Yep.
combinations would be really good, and in reality, it's just not
Yep.
feasible. It's like, well, by the time you're 12 turns in, your opponent's got a full board, you're down to 5 life. Like, there's no way you're going to pull that combo off. But if you just kind of
Yep.
jump in and without a sense of, how are these cards supposed to go together, it can be hard to
Mm.
to find that without really going and studying, like, okay, what cards were released at the same time, how did people figure out these fit?
Yeah, it's got to be quite a labyrinth for Magic, just in terms of like with Hearthstone, at least it's all it's all digital, so there's it's well organized, very easy to find different cards, different places, and the time periods, and they lock out certain cards right for certain eras. To worry about that, but with Magic, yeah, trying to like backtrack through all these releases and trying to find different ways in which, unless of course you're entirely current, but I understand that's pretty hard and expensive to do
Yeah.
with that particular game. So in any case, no, it's interesting, especially in terms of like talking about trying to figure out the standardized play or the solving a certain game type that we're talking about with MOBAs. That in card games have to happen every single time a new expansion.
Right.
And you get to watch that kind of microcosm build up again, kind of from ground zero, obviously with some exception.
And in some ways, that is the game. Like that becomes most of
Exactly,
what people are doing in the game because there's no mechanical component to the game. And we've talked about that with Hearthstone before, but because you don't improve your mastery at controls and at things that are analog and
Like
as
a
much
card,
as much as
right.
like a video game can be, like lane positioning is a pretty, it's kind of on a spectrum, like, but whereas deck composition is not. Like you can list off the cards you need in your
Yeah,
deck. Lane positioning is
right,
like, it was pretty good or it was excellent. It's
right.
not quite
It's not
as clear cut.
distinct. Yep. And I wonder, like, I'm thinking about like other genres of games. Is that's just also just like a very new in some ways phenomena in terms of like the speed at which that can happen with online gaming. Like think about like playing games when we were younger, and or even like single player games, which were most of them, or like Street Fighter or some like co-op game or Mario Kart stuff like that, where you pretty much play by yourself or with like a few friends, and you figure out the game as best you can, and then maybe it's really inefficient, and then suddenly you play someone else who's just like appears to be like god tier, right? Just like so much better
Right.
because maybe they stumbled across just a better way to play that you didn't ever think of. And other games, like you didn't never even think in those terms. Like early, like Crash Bandicoot or Jack Daxter, those kind of like platformers that I played a lot of when I was younger. Today if you're talking to like people playing through them, you will absolutely figure those games out because of just the spread of information being so quick and so massive. You can pretty much find the solved game anywhere. Look hard enough.
Yeah, especially for fixed games like that. Now, tying it back to our discussion about like regional differences in gameplay, I do still think there's
Yeah.
variance in even just countries
E-Star.
or leagues.
Gaming. That was the name of the Chinese game.
What was
Finally remembered
what was it called?
E-Star. The letter E and then the word star.
E-Star. Okay. So like E-Star, for example,
And
was, although they did have access, it's not that they couldn't play on North American servers, but I mean, it probably would have had high latency and there's probably other reasons why they didn't want to do that, but they tended to play with people in their country. And so, although the internet has allowed access for fixed games like, Crash Bandicoot, where it's just solo player, to really, dive in and kind of solve how to play that game. Although I know that improvements do happen in speed runs from time to time. It's after the initial routing
yeah,
happens, but uh,
yeah,
even with competitive games where everybody is trying to solve and figure out the best way to play, you still end up with these regional pockets where just because
yeah,
you've been sharpened in a different way because you've been playing with a different crowd, your style is going to
yeah.
be a bit different than somebody who played in North America and had honed their
So,
skills in a different environment.
yeah, yeah, and I think that's a really cool. I mean, go back to our little blurb about like why games are important, why we love them. I think that's such a beautiful thing. Like the fact that it is this really deeply kind of human experience of getting to come together with other people and find unique and different ways to interact, even through the medium of a game. But it is this just kind of beautiful example of creativity and this place to be able to come and exemplify differences and strategy and skill and just kind of have a really cool way to like demonstrate the sheer diversity and breadth of people and the way they think and the way they approach things. I think it's really cool that it is different across the world,
Yeah, absolutely.
and it's very very apparent in games in terms of the way people play them. That certainly in a competitive sense, but even past that, just what different types of games are popular in different areas, Eastern, particularly Eastern versus Western, but even past that, EU versus NA has a lot of differences outside of just pure skill, which, a key one. But European games always have a very, very different feel from North American ones, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, it becomes a reflection of the people who have played together, and of a
Yep,
culture. Like the
yep,
very
totally.
fact that there is a Chinese style way to play um, a MOBA like Heroes of the Storm is, I think, a testament to what games really are. Like they really
Yep,
do take on, if there's enough flexibility in the game, and I think
yep,
that bar
yep,
is quite
absolutely.
low. I mean, basically outside of like tic-tac-toe, even chess, which is very very structured, has regional ways to play. I mean, that's why you have
Yep,
things like oh shoot, there are some openings and some moves that are named after certain countries. Which I will probably
really.
look up after this. But yeah, there are there are certain openings that are named after specific countries, and it's because
Yep,
that region preferred that style of play. Um,
yep,
and yeah, so anyway, I think it really is a testament to the way that games evolve and what we're talking about, which is that strategies are localized and are kind of passed down, and it's almost an inheritance from the culture that you play the game in. So if I'm playing
yeah,
on North
totally,
American
totally.
servers, that game is passed down to me, and it isn't the same game. It's not the same attitude and approach that I would have passed down to me if I was playing on a Chinese server or Korean server. Um,
Totally, totally.
it's a different culture.
Yeah, and I think that's. I mean, it sounds like if there's any, in our massive listener base at this point, sounds like a friggin' anthropology like thesis, being able to like think about how a culture is reflected in the way it plays games, the way it approaches games, the way it approaches competition. Absolutely, we're talking about uh, video games in general, and that's a recent thing. But even past that, board games, the way that leisure comes about, sports obviously being a very obvious game. I just think that's absolutely fascinating to think about how that is a inherent thing. And then from there, to talk about like kind of the this could be kind of a subtopic, or we could talk about this maybe in a later episode, just about like why Korea is kind of the ultimate esports country
Well,
at the moment.
I think we should jump back on topic here, but I do think that could
Yeah, for
easily
sure.
be
We
its
definitely
own thing. So as almost like a to throw this out as a
what was the
potential
topic?
solution. Yeah, right. I have an idea, something I want to throw out as a potential solution for this. Um,
Oh,
Basically,
please do.
inability to respond to really off the wall strategies and tactics that beginner
Yep.
players might use. Which is is part of what I would call beginner's luck. And it's again, I'm gonna borrow from chess, but have you ever heard of Fisher randomized chess?
I don't think so.
So in Fisher randomized chess, the pieces are more or less randomly distributed in the two rows where they're normally placed. So you get a
Okay.
chessboard, but the pieces are completely out of order, and then you play a normal game of chess. And what this does is it puts you in situations that you would never be if you just sat in the clearly defined chess meta. Um, and
Right.
it forces you to deal with a situation where your queen is buried in the back row and their queen is out in
Yeah.
front, and you've got to deal with that, and you haven't had time to also develop your queen. I think what it does is it keeps players sort of cognitively and strategically flexible to be able to assess and
Yeah.
respond in the moment, and as opposed to
Yeah.
just following a script or
Yeah. Totally.
a canned response to a specific situation.
Yeah. You keep all the building blocks in some ways in terms of just the pure pieces and the way they work constant, but
Hmm.
just randomized setup.
Yeah.
Really interesting.
Like, what if we had a random Overwatch team that, you know, you were assigned a character and you just had to figure out how to deal with having all tanks. You have all tanks, and
Right.
how are you going to win this match?
Right.
Um, And to League's credit, they have a mode called ARAM, all random, all mid, and
Right.
character you are a random champion. And I think that
Yep.
that's probably a good way for people to practice dealing with different team compositions and doing well. Now, the maps are
Right.
dissimilar enough. I'm not sure if it's actually a good way to stay on your toes for the main game, what I would consider the main game,
Right.
which is the 5v5 Summoner's Rift competitions. But
Right.
I think that that is a part of a solution to this problem of people being unable to cope with innovation and bizarre strategies.
Yeah, yeah. And so much as, I mean, obviously, like we were saying earlier, probably 90% of the time, a lot of these kind of tried and true game methods are going to say having something to be really disruptive and actually works is probably going to be very rare.
Yes, yeah, it's quite
So
rare.
almost. But in so much as we were talking about that kind of like cognitive like rigidity, that can kind of, like you say, be really detrimental to when one of those strategies does come up. Having modes like that that do force you to be in the same game, but really think outside the box, and kind of encourage more cognitive flexibility. In so much as that would be really helpful, I think that's a really cool thought in terms of it's different. Like obviously the ARAM, figure randomization, or a truly random Overwatch mode would never be competitive, right? It's never
Right,
going to make mainstream because obviously there's just always the possibility that you just get a better team composition than the other
right,
person, or that you get just a really, really favorable random set of pieces and they get a really horrible one and you can just obliterate them, right? Or in Overwatch, right? That you get like, one tank, 4 damage dealers, 1 healer, and you get 4 damage dealers, just not going to win that.
right.
But like you said, in so much as, hey, if it's not about winning, it's not competitive about that point. If it's, hey, how can we try to make this work? I think it's a fantastic idea for learning how to shake up a meta. I wonder if that would be a cool thing to even systemize for like professional teams, right? Like, hey, maybe we'll have an hour a day where we just try. I don't know how they do this. I'm sure that they do. But in terms of like trying to learn new ways and counter, as opposed to just practicing the old ones, find new things and actually innovate. That could be a really good way to do that, right? Just throw in some things, some random chance to it, and say, hey, make this work. What are you guys gonna do? If you can find a way to make it work, then great.
Yeah.
Other people will not see that coming.
Yeah, that's true. And even if you don't learn how to make it work better than the established strategy, because as we've said, that's unlikely. Like the established strategy is there
Right.
for a reason. But
Right.
even if it's not better than that, I still think that you have something that you've learned and you've gained from dealing with a different situation or playing the game from a different perspective. And I'm not privy to what they do in some of these competitive gaming houses, but they might do random scrimmages. I think that would be a fantastic way to train, where you divide your
Random scrims.
you divide your team in half. If I don't, maybe they only have enough players for one side of the game, but if they could find
In general, yeah.
a friendly team that they could scrimmage with, and just say like, we're doing a
Right.
random scrimmage, we're gonna get random characters. This isn't for pride or for glory. It's just for learning the game and deepening our understanding of the dynamics of the play.
Yeah.
Um, I think
Yeah.
that would both teams would benefit from that. I really do.
Yeah, for sure. The one danger there would be if you do find something sick that actually works, then the other team knows about it, and it's not going to be a surprise anymore.
That's true.
So I
That is
imagine
true.
the internal testing's got to be kind of safe in that regard, because that is one big advantage of coming to the tournament and saying, hey, that's part of tournament strategy, right? Like group stages, not pulling out some of the stuff that you've practiced and is kind of off the wall, just kind of not showing your hand too early, and then being able to pull it out in like semifinals, finals, where it might work, and they won't know what to do with it. So,
Right.
but no, I totally agree in terms of kind of trying to get outside of that pure establishment and really actually iterate on something. That's another interesting thought is like basically that what we are assuming here is actually a completely stable meta in terms of like we're talking about like a Smash style thing.
That's true.
There aren't patches, right? We're not talking about any balance, because every time a balance patch comes in, to an extent, right? Like the most recent Overwatch patch, which I don't know if you can start playing before this, but had some pretty major changes to the character Roadhog.
Yep. I did know about that.
And then Reaper and McCree had slight changes as well that probably won't be too groundbreaking. Although I will say, just incidentally, anecdotally, I've been seeing a lot more Reaper in quick match and not competitive I wonder if that's just a, hey, you got changed, let's try him out, or if it's because changing the way he's going to get played, he's actually a very, very viable option now. So, but anyway, point is, where that kind of, like I said, that like microcast on time to relearn the game is definitely less apparent than, like, say, when a new Hearthstone um, expansion gets released, and you have to kind of rethink the whole game.
Right.
But it's definitely significant in terms of balance patches, and that people are iterating and trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
Another little piece of argument for slower balance patching, letting players be able to iterate and find out, and that doing so will actually force them to be able to be more flexible in their thinking, as opposed to just being given these changes and then that's just a different type of analysis. Hey, do you think have changed? How does it change it? As opposed to, hey, here are all these constants that have been constant for a while. How can I get more mileage out of some of this stuff?
Right. Yeah, you force the players to go through um, to shake the game up themselves, basically, in what might be
Right.
randomized trials or however they decide to do that. It reminds me a little bit of a parallel, which I will not take too long on because I might lose a lot of people here. But there's a concept in artificial intelligence called simulated annealing, which comes
Okay.
from the real phenomenon of forging a tool, which is called annealing,
Uh-huh.
where you heat
Uh-huh.
it up and then you beat it into shape and then you cool it off and then you heat it up again and you alternate between those two. And the
Right.
idea is that eventually the tool converges on the shape that you want. But you
Yeah.
see this happening in all sorts of places. It's made its way into the AI world for sure, machine learning, but uh, it
Yeah.
happens. I think you could make an argument that it sort of happens with metas, where
Yeah.
players come up with a strategy, and maybe certain characters are kind of outliers. They're either too good or too bad, and then the developer comes in, they beat the game into shape a bit more, and maybe they refine some things,
Iterate on.
and it keeps solidifying and becoming more and more a well-designed game. Now, that doesn't take into account the
Yeah.
addition of new content, which is kind of where this analogy breaks down, because you aren't just
Right.
trying to
Yeah.
make the game more of what it already is. You are at times as a developer trying
Right.
to augment the game and push it in a new direction
Yeah.
sometimes. So it isn't
Yeah.
a perfect analogy, but I do think you
Which is a
see
really
a meta
difficult.
is evolving that way.
Yeah. Which is a really difficult thing in terms of, like, just games being in fact business, right? By definition, and pushing new content is, particularly paid content, is the way you keep the game going. It's always that kind of push and pull between, we speak very purely and very probably naively, about just kind of this idea of games as this thing that brings things together. When in fact, it's that, but it's also a very very high kind of cutthroat business in a lot of ways. So I would argue that many games would rather happily sacrifice some of the pure kind of like idealistic versions of some of these ideas for a piece of new content that people are going to pay for, and then and the game will adjust accordingly, and so on and so forth. Overwatch has been interesting in that when it adds new characters, those have been totally free, or just added a new map, right? Lunar Colony, which is really cool. I don't think there's been any paid Overwatch content that has been, like, there's been no paid DLC basically, which is a rarity, especially for a game that popular. They could make a freaking fortune off that.
Yeah, I actually I don't think I fully understand. Maybe eventually they'll come up with some sort of pricing model for their giveaways or their skins and things like that. But the loot,
You can buy loot boxes, so it's all aesthetic,
right?
DLC that they can buy with real money. But there's been no game content basically. Like,
Hmm.
they do all these seasonal events, right? And many times they'll have new game modes. And like I said, they've done, I think, at least two new maps, three with Iconwall, Oasis, and Lunar Colony now. I think, or no, Eagle Point, Antarctica as well. So like four new maps and three new characters. So it's a lot of content.
Yeah. Well, in our defense, the defense of our discussion, I guess, I do think we approach games more from we do a lot of comparing to games like chess, to games like soccer, to games that aren't
Right.
a business. There's nobody running soccer. There
Sure.
are soccer leagues that
Right.
people run,
Well, FIFA, but
um, Yeah, but like the game of soccer is not officiate or run or owned by anybody. It's not copyrighted.
Yeah, that's true.
Um,
You don't have to pay someone when you go play soccer. Yeah.
exactly.
You don't
Like,
have to
and you
purchase
do with
soccer.
Overwatch. Like
You don't have to unlock soccer.
exactly. So and so we do make a lot of these comparisons, and I think there's value in that. But it isn't a perfect comparison because um,
Yeah, for sure.
it is also a business, and that's a great point.
Yep. Something to remember is that a lot of this, is, it's not just this microcosm of trying to figure out how best to make games work. It is in fact how to make money. And of course, those two things run together, right? Any piece of excellent art or something worth buying it's gonna have to be good.
Right, exactly. Yeah, if the game's not fun for the players, then you aren't going to have a very successful game.
Yeah, yeah.
So you want games that are going to
An
be
interesting.
fun to stream, fun to watch, fun to talk about.
Yep,
I think that is an important part of a game that people might not think about immediately when they think about making a really good game.
totally. I was thinking about so back to the beginner's luck thing for a second. We were talking a lot about how there's this naivety to people that play games, and that can oftentimes lead them to do something kind of stupid, but it actually could work out really well. Do you think what? So there's like that level of beginner's luck. Then there's like another level of like somehow hitting a great skill shot like perfectly, or like doing something mechanically that they shouldn't really be able to do that well. Like think about like bowling, right? Like I remember being like a kid and throwing like 160 or something like that, which is pretty darn good for like an 8-year old or whatever.
Yeah, I don't know if I've bowled
And then
160.
I've never well I've that. But like, obviously in that time period, I never threw anyone close to that. Like breaking 100 is so great. Um, so there's this other level of beginner's luck, I think, that sometimes comes into play. Just purely, you have any thoughts on that? It's kind of off the cuff, but someone just like hit something and then will not be able to do it again, right? It's just kind of this one-off thing. But it does seem to have enough correlation with beginners that obviously that phrase has come into popular use.
I think that's more mechanical beginner's luck than strategic, just to make a distinction between what
Yeah,
we've been
yeah,
talking about. But my initial reaction to having you thinking through that while you describe it is that I
yeah,
think a lot of mechanical things in a game people initially overthink. And that's the classic
yeah, sure.
development from an
I agree
amateur
with that. No,
into
that's
an
a great point.
expert. And so when you go in as a
Good point.
beginner and you're not trying to be good, you're just having fun, you aren't thinking
Yeah,
super hard mechanically about what's going on. And then
that's a good
you're
point.
really good for a moment, and then you start trying to replicate that, and you start thinking really hard
Yeah,
about it, and you become self-conscious. And
yeah,
that's good. You need to do that so you
yeah.
can do that good thing consistently. But I think that
Totally,
beginners are still
totally.
capable of being mechanically good. They're just also going to be mechanically
Yeah.
bad a lot of the time. And so
No, yeah, that's
to try to get from good to good all the time, good occasionally to good all the time, you've got to deconstruct that goodness and go into your head and really analyze your
yeah,
performance. And in that
yeah, and be
process,
able to
you'll be
justify
more
everything.
consistent, but
Yeah,
you might actually be consistently worse than you were at your peak as a beginner, which is a really interesting thing.
yeah, totally. I mean, think about like a golf swing, right? That's kind of one of the classic ones that you go up to a driving range and having a kid. Yeah, I remember this being young. My dad took me to the driving range and the best hits I did are obviously the ones that I got out of my head. I would concentrate a little bit, try to make sure things were set, but usually the best ones were the ones that I was able to let go of trying to get out of my head. And the more I thought about it, the worse I played,
Right.
or at least hit the ball. And so that's a simple example, but I think it's absolutely true in other things. Just the mechanical sense of going instinctually to things, and not trying too hard and getting in the way. I think that's a great point. I hadn't thought of that, but that's probably a big part of it. And of course, obviously, like you said, that'd be inconsistent. And the way to bring up consistency is to practice, to be able to analyze, construct, systemize. But initially, yeah, you're right. That's a cool thing. I was thinking just more purely socially, there might be some availability kind of bias or confirmation bias in terms of people seeing, even if there is just a set level of luck across the board that everyone would experience, people probably pay attention to that luck more in beginners because it's more remarkable.
Right.
And so maybe it doesn't have anything necessarily to do with beginners necessarily. It's just people pay attention to a beginner doing well more.
Right. There's a greater
Totally.
contrast between the expected skill level when you get lucky.
Right.
Like if
Right.
Michael Jordan gets lucky and sinks a basket, you hardly would
Right.
even notice it. You'd just be like, well, he's really good.
Right. Totally. As opposed to, yeah, totally. So maybe it's a combination of all three of those things. I'm just like the natural bias of thought. Obviously, the lack of cognitive rigidity when it comes to strategy, and then, like you said, kind of that lack of
Self-consciousness.
Some more, self-consciousness, more instinct coming through mechanically.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a bad thesis for beginner's luck. I mean, obviously, none of that's usually substantiated by anything, but that's a damn good.
Hey,
little,
it's a starting point.
Yeah, that's cool. I love systems. I love being able to put stuff into places and make it all make sense. It's not a bad place to start.
Yeah, I think that could be the end of our conversation today. We'll wrap up there.
I think so. I think that's a great closing point. So next time we're thinking gonna talk about SPSs as a whole and part of the story there and
yes.
how they've iterated and become what they are.
Yeah, we're gonna go through. There's a couple. Actually, there's probably more than a couple, but there's two in my mind specifically, major FPSs right now that I want to discuss and compare. One of those is Overwatch. Uh, the other one being PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds or PUBG or Pubs or whatever you want to call it. And so we're gonna be
a third-person shooter, but
that's true. Okay, fair enough. But they're both shooters and they're popular right now. We'll talk about, kind of what the differences and what even the perspective might have on the game. The idea of being in the action versus being removed from your character even. But anyway, that's for another episode. So cool. All right, Greg. Well, it was great to talk with you. As always, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, check us out on Twitter or Facebook.
Give us some feedback on our thoughts. Mark and I will talk about the ideas for shows, and we'll kind of flesh out ideas. But a lot of it's kind of off the cuff. So if we're missing stuff, or if you have some feedback or responses, please let us know.
Yeah, we're both reachable. You can email Mark at gamingmechanics.net or Greg at gamingmechanics.net. You'll get us, and we'll be happy to respond.
Yeah, cool. Sweet, man. Well, good talking to you.
Yeah, good talking to you too. All right, take care, Greg.